Let's start at the beginning. I thought it'd be interesting just to find out because, this is something very, very big that you've created. Obviously, it takes a huge amount of energy to do something like that. Why bother?
I'm kind of a child of the internet. I had two great parents, but my third parent was the internet. I was online at a very young age. The promise of the internet in the 90s and even into the early 2000s was that it was going to be this freeing, empowering technology, where everyone was going to be free to communicate and anyone could say what they wanted to other people. And I think in the last decade, and particularly in the last couple of years, the internet has become more closed and more restrictive than it ever has been. We've seen major politicians in the United States, we've seen licensed medical professionals be deplatformed, be unable to communicate through basically every major social platform. And here in Hungary, I gather there are a lot of these problems as well, where there are laws that are restricting journalists, restricting journalism, laws about what kinds of books can be published. It's a real problem. And the current solutions, the big tech solutions...
Sorry, just to step in there, though. But I think part of that problem is because people see that there are dangers out there. Precisely as you said, for you, the internet was like a third parent. And I myself know, it's had some negative effects on my kids as well. So surely government should be stepping in and should have that power to be able to control.
I think that's a choice for parents. And we've seen this argument against every kind of new technology. This same argument would have been made against the printing press. And yeah, the printing press was destabilizing, right? It arguably caused the Protestant Reformation. And so it is true that when people can communicate freely, sometimes there is a little bit of unsettlement, but ultimately things are better when people are able to communicate freely.
Isn't it better to hear all the voices that are out there? Or is it better, what are the times when we have to, stop those voices and, silence them, which is what happened basically to Donald Trump, in a way. Although I know we'll come back to that in a later debate later on. But so what's your opinion? Do you think that, just on that, you think it's better to hear all the voices that are out there?
Well, our attitude is that we should be letting people make their own choices about what they want to be allowed to see and hear. Our intent is not to be, putting edgy things or misleading things in your face, but we don't think it's our place to decide for you what you're allowed to see and watch. Especially when you talk about who we're giving this power to, which is generally either the government or some of the largest companies in the world that we're mistrustful of in every other context. And if I ask you personally, would you like Mark Zuckerberg to decide what you're allowed to see, or would you rather make that decision for yourself? Pretty much everyone says, I want to make it for themselves. When people are concerned about this kind of thing, they're generally concerned about it for other people. They don't want other people to be allowed to hear these things.
Well, yeah, that's the great thing about us as human beings. We tend to be very optimistic about ourselves, very pessimistic about everybody else out there. But then I think that's why we sort of want somebody to regulate it. Before we get into that debate, perhaps it would be good for you to just, try and explain. What is the difference between, the technology you use with Odyssey, the blockchain technology, just so that we can, not to get into the Merkle tree and things like that, but, just for us to understand how it does create the trust and transparency.
Sure. So there's two parts to it. So there's Odyssey.com, which is very easy to use. That's part of why, and by the way, not that your information was wrong, we've just been growing very fast. 40 million last month now. But I couldn't give you those numbers when you first contacted me because that was just last month.
So it's growing very quickly.
It's growing very, very quickly. It's very easy to use. And like driving a car, you don't have to understand how it works, right? You're right that you start talking about Byzantine fault tolerance, Byzantine generals problem, Merkle trees, it starts getting complicated. Well, if I just tried to describe how your car worked, which I probably couldn't, it's very complicated. Is it complicated to drive a car? Not really, right? You push a button, it turns on, you press some pedals, right? And so Odyssey is the car, all right? Library is the blockchain technology that empowers it. And there are other applications and other things that can use libraries. So library is sort of like Bitcoin, We like to say that library does to publishing what Bitcoin does to money. And what Bitcoin does to money is it puts it back in your local control. It says there's no central authority that's going to control how we move our money. Library does the same thing for publishing. So you have local control over your identity, you have local control over what you've published, and we think that's a far better paradigm than giving all of your power to one of these Silicon Valley companies.
Why do you think people are sort of fighting against this control now?
Well, I think substantially because what's happened has been unprecedented. I mean, it really is. I mean, and I can speak to U.S. examples much more than examples in Hungary, but in the U.S. we have not just the president, but sitting senators who are not allowed to communicate over social media. We have congressional testimony, so that is testimony that was given, under oath in Congress that's not allowed to be aired on social media. We have medical professionals, fully licensed medical professionals that are not allowed to communicate on social media, and their medical licenses aren't getting taken away, right? We're literally at a place where the bar to practice medicine is lower than the bar to communicate online, and I don't think that's a healthy place to be.
So, if you don't think it's a healthy place to be, but somehow, if we go back to the beginning, there must be money behind this from some people. Some people are it's a profit-making organization, I guess. So there are influences behind it.
You're talking about the Silicon Valley companies or mine?
Or about let's say, something like Odyssey.
Sure. Well, and this is where it can get important to differentiate library and Odyssey. Odyssey is a profit-seeking vehicle. It is going to work with advertisers. There's already content that's not allowed on Odyssey, right? Odyssey has moderators, this kind of thing. The underlying library technology is closer to something like email, right? There's no moderator of email. There's no ability to reach into someone's inbox and take their messages away. And that's what we want to do is turn publishing into something closer to that, where you're not trapped in one provider. If Odyssey starts treating you badly, there are other apps, there's other ways that you can use it. And this can be a little bit difficult to get our head around, but really the closest comparison is email, where it's like you can use Gmail, someone else can use Proton Mail, someone else can be self-hosting their mail server, and we can all communicate. And there's not nearly the same ability for you to be simply silenced from the ability to communicate with others. So library is more like that. Odyssey is like one particular provider, which may have its own rules.
Mm-hmm. But so somebody is creating the rules there.
Odyssey does have some rules, yeah, and that's us. That's my company making them. But our promise is that we've sort of tied our own hands. So if Odyssey ever becomes evil, you're not trapped. Right? When you build up, it's sort of like owning a house versus renting, right? If you're building up a following on social media, on the traditional Web 2.0 sort of social media, you're renting. If you don't own your identity, it's owned by someone else, and the rules can change on you at any time, and you can get kicked out. When you build up a following on library, you own your channel in the same way that you own your Bitcoin. It can't get taken away from you unilaterally, and the rules can't be changed on you unilaterally. And also in terms of the sort of it's all open source, so people can fork it, people can take it in different directions. You have much more control. It's like owning. There's not this ability for someone to come in and change the rules on you. And there's a lot more stakeholders because the tokens are distributed, right? So all of those token holders, they have a little bit of a stake in the network. So you're not just sort of building something else for someone else, you're building something up for yourself.
So you build something up for yourself, but there are advertisers.
Not on library.
Not in library,
No.
Okay. So how does it make money?
The protocol itself doesn't make money. You can put a price on your content, so you can sort of set certain monetization rules. But the library itself does not make money for the people who created it.
Okay, but there is something, if I say, this utility token, or maybe I misunderstand the utility token, what it's used for, but there is a transaction going on.
That's right. So when you publish something to the library network, the same way that you would make a Bitcoin transaction, you're making a transaction to the library blockchain. That does cost a small amount of the cryptocurrency, but we're talking about less than a penny per publish, so it's very cheap. I'm giving US dollars. I know it's probably like 1 forint or something, but it's very cheap.
Okay. All right. So what is, what do you believe, if this blockchain technology carries on, and, you talk about publishing, you also talk about, the commercial transactions, you're talking about finance as well. What's the dream? I mean, what can you promise us in the future if this becomes successful? How much better is it going to be?
Well, I think everything bad that's happened with big tech can't happen again with this design. And I think Google was
can or can't?
Cannot happen, right? So and I think all of these companies, Google especially, was much better a decade ago than they are today. And this is sort of the traditional Silicon Valley game. And I'm in this space, and I talk to VCs, and it's very common to say, well, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to corner the market, and then we're going to turn the monetization dial. And turn the monetization dial generally means screw people over, is basically what they mean. They mean make the service worse so that they can make more money off of it. And these things just can't play out the same way in this design. So your library can scale to globally to handle basically everyone in the entire world. Everyone can own their own identity. It's not owned by my company. You own your identity. And we would like all the world's sort of digital art, digital publishing, everything from books to movies, all of it can be published on the library network.
If we, you talked about, you mentioned how things that, people are basically being cancelled out, and we see what happened with someone like Trump, and he was banned from Facebook. And a lot of people will say, well, maybe that was right, because, there was a lot of, there was the potential for big, violent disturbance. On the other hand, it could be viewed as something else. So what is the difference between you and Facebook? I mean, because you're basically saying anything can go, you can publish anything you want, nobody's actually controlling it, but then you could have people who are very clever at exploiting people's personal drives.
Well, you can still do that at the level above. So for people who are concerned, you can have various filters and things like that. But no, fundamentally, I don't accept, and I think sort of our proposition is that people shouldn't accept that someone else has the right to decide what you're allowed to watch. And I think that this is, and it's actually, I think it's strange how sort of to even have that norm, because it seems to be only something online, right? Like pretty much no one holds the norm that I should interfere from two people talking in a coffee shop, right? Or I should stop people from having a conversation in the public square. And so I think we should hold those same principles online. If we don't think it's right to go over to someone and literally like stop them from talking in real life, why would we hold that right online that we should stop someone from talking, online, right? Especially, and it's especially strange that it was happening during the COVID era when people are being asked to stay at home, to not leave their houses, and then they're also not allowed to communicate online. And to me, that's pretty dystopian. And yeah, that doesn't mean I agree with a lot of these people. I'm not saying that I think that everyone who was deplatformed was a good person or was saying things that I agree with, but that doesn't matter. For the same reason that I wouldn't go over and cover someone's mouth, I don't want to cover their mouth online. Odyssey may, right? So we may not help it on Odyssey, but that in that decentralized network, if two people want to communicate, we can't stop it, and we don't think it's right that it should be stopped.
Okay. It still raises there's still a bit of an issue there because, we don't want to see things like child pornography online, and you're saying that wouldn't happen with your technology.
So there's a way to mark certain sectors of the blockchain as containing illegal data, right? Nodes and other operators that want to operate legally will listen to those instructions. And the penalties for breaking that law are very severe, right? So people would have to know, they'd have to modify the software, they'd have to knowingly be breaking the law, and they can be caught the same way that we catch them currently, right? So there's not, in that regard, this isn't something that's making it easier to do those kinds of things. But in the same way right now that if someone emails someone an illegal file, there's not an ability to reach in and take that away. So you have to identify what computers are doing it, and you have to catch those people. And you can still do that in this system.
Okay, and you're saying that it's all about whether it's legal or illegal.
Yes.
That's the sort of black and white line.
Yeah.
But then herein lies the problem, because what might be legal and illegal in the States may be totally different to what's legal and illegal in Hungary.
So this is an area in which the design is still evolving, although it's most of the way done. We're actually moving towards a model where you'll have to be sort of setting your jurisdiction, and the nodes that you're communicating with, if you want to use, you have to communicate with nodes in your legal jurisdiction so that they're able to return the right kind of legal information, for you.
All right, okay. Well, I think we've covered those points quite a lot. Let's just get into perhaps a little bit more of a sort of philosophical debate, and I'm curious about your own philosophies. I mean, you've used Google, Facebook, you've talked about them a lot, and you've talked about how governments control them. What do you think, how has that happened? Has that been, people, is it something that's just happened organically? Or do you think people saw the opportunity and thought, right, I mean, how paranoid should we be at the moment? I guess that's the question.
It depends on how conspiratorial you are, I suppose. I mean, I tend to not be that conspiratorial. I think part of what's going on is simply that these companies are run by people, not just run by, but staffed by people that are predominantly of one ideology, right? And so it's something like, at Facebook, it's like 95% of people working at Facebook donated to Democrats versus 5% donating to Republicans. And regardless of how you feel about the two parties, when you see that it's that lopsided in one direction, it's unlikely that people are going to be neutral in terms of how they apply the rules. I'm very, very skeptical of any human being to truly be neutral, including myself. I don't think we're good at that. We all have our own biases, and we apply those biases in terms of how we, interpret things. So when you're asking human beings to make judgment calls about whether something is an incitement to violence or whatever it is even just insulting or is misinformation. People's own biases are going to come into play. And so I think a big part of it is that these companies have become completely dominated by people of one particular set of political beliefs, and it plays out in all of the decisions that they end up making. That's the non-conspiratorial explanation. The more conspiratorial people would believe things that, like, the high-up politicians are working directly with the Silicon Valley companies or other corporate companies are working directly with them.
What do you think has been the change in politics now that, social media has been around for sort of 20, 30 years? And I'm sure, like you said, people who are putting content on YouTube, they have no idea what advertisers are advertising, following which I suppose is something you want to work against. So the question is, what's been that sort of rebound from the political side? And I know you got, it's just, what's your philosophy on that?
Well, on the advertising front, I'll say that our model is choice. We always want to give people a choice. And so you'll always be able to opt out of ads by sort of paying the commensurate cost, which is quite low. When you're watching a YouTube ad, that's frequently generating a penny in revenue or less, that view for the creator. But in terms of the sort of broader societal effects, I think one of the things that social media has done is it's really generally, it's weakened the influence, power, and trust that people put in elites. Because, we sort of can see more that a lot of them are either self-serving or more wrong than we might have otherwise believed. I think we are going through a bit of a crisis, a trust crisis, in terms of who should be trusted, who can be trusted. I think there is sort of less respect and credence given to these kinds of authority figures certainly than there ever has been in my lifetime. And I think social media is why that's happened. So
on one side, you're saying that these people in power seem to feel less answerable, and on the other side, they're less trustable as well.
Sure. There's an argument. Like, what's the analogy? So the Berlin Wall, separating West Germany from East Germany, it didn't go up at the end of World War II. It went up about 15, 20 years later, something like this. And the wall became necessary because people started to want to leave, because people stopped believing in the promises that were being made by the communist government. And so there's an analogy here where the walls are going up, the control is going up, not because they're asserting more dominance than ever before, but because they're actually weaker than ever before. It's a reflection of the weakness that they need to do these things, and I don't think it's going to work.
Great. Okay, it's a very nice analogy, and I think that leaves a good visual for us. One other thing, I mean, we are talking a lot about the environment here at this conference, and we know that, we've seen these pictures, blockchain technology, the energy is massive, and then also we hear about, mining a Bitcoin takes, 53 American household electricity bills for a year or something like that. How can you overcome that? Because that's obviously another attack that you may get.
Totally. Well, Library uses way less energy than Bitcoin does. We are open-minded about sort of switching models to something like a proof of stake or other designs. We're waiting to see how all of that sort of plays out. We're sort of conservative in that regard, in the sense that we'll let other blockchain companies prove that these things work. But assuming that they do work, we're not dogmatic about being on these proof of work type systems. But more generally, the solution to these problems is, in my opinion, not to regulate them. If there are externalities from using electricity, put that into the cost of electricity. We have to use market mechanisms to solve these problems. So if there's an activity that human beings are doing that's creating this negative externality, you have to adjust it at the root source. You have to adjust the prices. I think that sort of attempting to this is a complex answer getting into this, but I think attempting to regulate these things at that level will fail for the same reason that central planning fails. You need to fix it at the lower level, and you need to use the price mechanism and market mechanisms to address those problems.
Okay, and to come back to the the title, can blockchain save free speech? Obviously, you believe free speech is under threat, and you've mentioned that because of the controls that are put on it by governments and by boards of governance and people like that. So you believe it should be totally free. So, what does free speech mean?
Yeah. Well, my answer is that blockchain can save free speech. It is saving free speech. We are winning, and free speech means that I can talk to you and you can talk to me, and that's a choice that we make between each other as to whether or not we want to hear each other. It's not a choice that a third party makes for us about whether you and I can communicate. And that's what this project is all about. That's fundamental to my values and the values of the people who work on this project.
Right, and actually, as you mentioned, most people who work for an organization will have the same kind of values, so they're probably all into the values of free speech and being deregulated. So thanks very much to Jeremy Kauffman.
Thank you.